Hey, we're back. All right, let's continue on. Oh, you're facing down. There we go.
Welcome back to Jarhead Jed, where adventure is always just around the corner. This stretch of the ride carries me the rest of the way through Hurricane Gap and down towards Hot Springs. The conditions haven't let up, and if anything, they've shifted again. The rain that followed me most of the day has started to turn. The temperature has dropped just enough to take it from miserable to something a little more serious. That cold, wet rain starts mixing with snow, and you realize pretty quickly that this isn't just uncomfortable anymore. It's something you need to respect. And somewhere in the middle of that, I found myself thinking less about the road and more about the question that's been sitting in the background this whole time. Why choose this? Not just this ride, but this kind of ride. By the time I was moving through Hurricane Gap, the cold had settled in deep enough that it stopped being something you noticed and started being something you just carried. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't biting. It was just there, consistent, steady, working its way in whether you paid attention to it or not. The rain had shifted too. It wasn't clean drops. It had that heavier feel to it. That mix where you know the temperature has crossed the line. You look down and see it building in places it wasn't before. You feel it in your gloves. You see it collecting on the tank, on the windshield. It's not dramatic, but it's enough to know things are changing. And in the middle of that, I had one of those thoughts that made me laugh a little. Heated grips. I've always been skeptical of them, never really saw the point. I always figured it was one of those things people convince themselves they need. But I'll tell you this, on that day, in those conditions, they proved themselves real quick. Not in some luxury kind of way, not like they made the ride easy, but they took just enough of the edge off to keep your hands working the way they needed to. And when you're out there, that matters more than you think. It's funny the things you reconsider when you're actually in it. And I think that applies to more than just gear. Because the further I rode, the more I started to realize that this whole idea, choosing the rain, choosing the discomfort, wasn't really about the ride anymore. It was about something underneath it. Something I've probably been trying to figure out for a long time. Why step into something that most people would avoid? Why choose to be uncomfortable when comfort is sitting right there as an option? And the answer isn't as simple as I wish it was. Part of it is practical, part of it's mental, part of it's spiritual, and it all overlaps. There's a quote from Teddy Roosevelt that I've always respected. Nothing in the world is worth having or worth doing unless it means effort, pain, difficulty. That's easy to read and agree with when you're sitting somewhere warm. It's a lot different when you're out in it, feeling every bit of that effort, pain and difficulty in real time. But that's exactly why it matters. Because it's one thing to agree with that idea in theory. It's another thing to live it. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, including me, if I'm being honest. We understand the idea of hardship being valuable. We just don't always choose it. We wait for it to show up on its own. But when you choose it, when you step into it on purpose, something changes. There's ownership in it. There's no one else to blame, no one else to credit. It's just you and the decision you made, and that forces you to be honest with yourself in a way that comfort never does. As I got closer to hot springs, that thought stuck with me more than anything else, because the environment around me was still shifting. The mountains had that quiet look to them, covered in fog, layered in gray, with just enough contrast to remind you how big they really are. There's a different kind of beauty in that. Not the kind you put on a postcard. Not the kind people travel to see on a clear summer day. It's something else, something quieter, something more honest. And I think riding in that kind of weather forces you to see it differently. You're not just looking at it, you're in it, fully immersed in it. And that changes your perspective. Because when everything is perfect, it's easy to stay on the surface of things. You see what's obvious, you take it in, but you don't necessarily connect with it. But when conditions are harder, when it's cold, wet, and uncomfortable, you don't have an option to stay detached. You're part of it whether you want to be or not. And that forces you to engage with it differently. There's a psychological side to that. When you remove comfort and distraction, your mind narrows in. You become more focused, more present, more aware. Not just of your surroundings, but of yourself. Jordan Peterson talks about this idea of voluntarily taking on responsibility and difficulty, not because it's enjoyable, but because it builds something in you that nothing else will. He said before that you should seek out the heaviest load you can carry and bear it. That's not about suffering for sake of suffering. That's about developing the kind of strength that only comes from carrying something difficult. And I think that applies here more than people realize. Because when you choose a ride like this, you're not just dealing with the physical side of it. You're dealing with your own mindset, your own willingness to stay in it, your own ability to keep moving forward when there's no external reason to do so. And that's where it gets real, because no one's out there telling you to keep going. No one's watching, no one's keeping score, it's just you. And that's where you find out what you're made of, or at least what you're not. There's a line from Fyodor Dostoevsky. The world says you have needs. Satisfy them. You have as much right to the rich and the mighty. Don't hesitate to satisfy your needs. Indeed, expand your needs and demand more. This is the worldly doctrine of today, and they believe that this is freedom. The result for rich is isolation and suicide. For the poor, envy and murder. And that hits harder the older I get, because comfort is easy to chase, convenience is easy to justify. But the more you rely on those things, the less capable you become without them. And that's a dangerous place to be, not just physically, mentally, spiritually. Because if your ability to function is tied to things being easy, you're going to struggle the moment they're not. And life guarantees that moment is coming. That's part of why I do this. Not because I enjoy being miserable, but because I don't want to become dependent on comfort. I don't want to need perfect conditions to show up. And I've learned that the only way to build that kind of resilience is to practice it. To step into something difficult on purpose. To stay in it longer than you have to. To see what happens. And what happens is usually this. You realize you're capable of more than you thought. But you also realize how easy it would be to quit. And that tension, that space between those two realizations, is where growth happens. As I rolled closer to hot springs, that contrast became even clearer. Because you're coming out of the mountains, out of that isolation, into a place that's still carrying the weight of something else entirely. Hurricane Helene didn't just pass through here. It left a mark. You can see it in the rebuilding, in the way things look a little out of place, in the sense that this isn't finished yet. And that adds another layer to the whole thing. Because now you're not just thinking about chosen hardship, you're seeing what unchosen hardship looks like. People didn't choose that storm. They didn't choose the damage it caused, but they're still dealing with it, still rebuilding, still moving forward. And that puts things into perspective real quick, because it reminds you that while there's value in choosing difficulty, there's also a responsibility in how you handle the difficulty that finds you. And I think that's where this connects with something deeper. Scripture doesn't avoid hardship. It leans into it. It talks about it directly, not as something to escape, but as something that produces something in you. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. James 1, 2, and 3. That idea that trials aren't just obstacles, but something that shapes you, that's not easy to accept, but it becomes easier to understand when you've experienced it. When you've chosen to stay in something uncomfortable and seen what it does to you, not immediately, not dramatically, but over time. It builds something steady, something real. And I think that's what I'm after more than anything. Not the ride itself, not the conditions, but what it produces. Because at the end of the day, that's what carries over. That's what shows up in your life when things aren't ideal. That's what determines whether you stand firm or fall apart. And I don't want to fall apart because things got hard. So I chose the rain. Not because it's fun, but it is in this sense. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's real. And when things are real, I tend to pay attention. And when I'm paying attention, I learn something. Not just about the road, not just about the ride, but about myself and about what actually matters. And as I left Hot Springs and started thinking about the ride home, I knew this wasn't the end of it. Because the ride back, that's where everything you've experienced gets tested. Not in the mountains, not in the isolation, but as you come back through it, back toward normal life, back toward everything that pulls your attention in 100 different directions. The next part of this ride takes me through Paint Creek, and I think that's where this whole thing comes full circle. Because it's one thing to find something out here, it's another thing to carry it with you when you leave. If you've been riding along with me, I appreciate it. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the final part. Because the ride home might be the most important part of all.